All right. So today I'd like to kind of give you an overview of kind of the findings of the Derelict Fishing Gear Task Force. This has been a multi-month process that we've worked on, and we're happy to share this today. So derelict fishing gear today is more commonly referred to as ALDFG, which just simply means uh, abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear. That's a common vernacular used to describe it today. And this can be composed of traps, pots, nets, ropes, buoys, etc. In Massachusetts, in our area, it's primarily comprised of lobster traps and rope from our commercial and recreational lobster fisheries, although there are occasionally also gill nets and other pot trap fisheries mixed in with that. Um, in general, the ADFG causes issues both on land and in the water. And the scale of this issue has increased in recent years as our fisheries have grown and as the materials used to construct fishing gear have evolved. Um, Efforts to manage this gear in Massachusetts are hampered by our current laws. And so this is kind of an overview of the presentation that I'm going to give you today. So in July of 2022, Director McKernan formed the Derelict Gear Task Force, where the purpose is to study the issue of ALDFG in Massachusetts waters and to develop solutions for the removal of such gear. Our thought here was to comprise a group of members from a broad cross section of stakeholders with experience in commercial fishing, fisheries policy and management, law enforcement, conservation, and derelict fishing gear and retrieval. The members included several DMF staff, including myself, Jared Silva, Dave Chosa, Julie Kaplan, Department Counsel, Assistant General Counsel Tori LeBate from the Department of Fish and Game, and then from law enforcement, we had Major Chris Baker. And then from outside the agency, we had Laura Ludwig from the Center for Coastal Studies. We had Beth Cassoni from Mass Lobstermen Association. And then we also had two of our commission members, Chair Raymond Kane, who also represents the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance, and also Suki Sawyer from the Mass Lobstermen Association, who's also an active lobster permit holder. So this is a really diverse group who, with a broad range of experience and history in the issue of derelict gear. So the question really is, like, why has it become such an issue in recent years? And simply from a broad scale, it's the scale of trap pot fisheries in massive increase, and advancements in the material used to construct gear has made it more durable and has allowed it to persist in the environment longer. To give you a sense of the scale of the fishery, this graph demonstrates kind of the performance of the lobster fishery in Massachusetts going back to the 1800s. And the solid line is the one I want you to key in on here, and that's the number of traps fished in the Massachusetts fishery. And so you can see early on, we had less than 50,000 traps in the water, and then roughly around World War II, we were up around 50,000, and then post World War II, we kind of saw a steady increase and then a dramatic increase where it reached a peak and traps fished in 1990. And since that time, it's come down a little bit, but it's still fairly a large amount of gear. And so in 2019, the scale of our fishery and for the commercial lobster is approximately 250 lobster traps, 12,000 whelk pots, about 4,500 commercial fish pots, and then in 2021 for recreational lobster pots, we estimate about 18,500. And based on work that DMF has conducted in the past through a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, we surveyed the fishing industry both commercially and then in subsequent years a recreational fishery, and we determined that roughly 7 to 10% of fishers, 7 to 10% of gear are lost annually by fishers. And so as a result, derelict gear compounds as more gear is lost annually, and the gear previously lost persists indefinitely. The other major contributing factor, as I mentioned earlier, is that the advancements in plastic and copolymers have led to wide-scale use in gear construction. So historically, you can see in the upper right corner is a typical wooden trap that would have been used in mass fisheries in the 60s, 70s, 80s. and to a lesser extent in the early 90s. But by about mid 1990s, with the exception of our outer Cape Cod fishery, which still use wooden lathe traps, greater than 95% of the traps deployed in Massachusetts are made of polyvinyl coated steel mesh, which is in the lower right corner picture. And this is a much more durable material, and it lasts for quite a long time. In the same time, historically, rope was made of jute, which is a biodegradable material, and now with advancements in plastics, the vast majority of all rope used in commercial fisheries are made of polyethylene and polypropylene, and these materials are not biodegradable. And then, based on some gear retrieval work conducted by the Center for Coastal Studies, the empirical evidence suggests that modern gears can persist in the environment for an excess of a decade, and that's based on looking at the trap tags that come up on gear retrieved in that program, and so we know that they, even after a loss, they continue to stay intact for quite a long time. So, what are the impacts of ALDFG in the marine environment? So, there are several, and they're fairly well understood. Ghost fishing is a big problem. It occurs when abandoned traps continue to catch and kill lobsters, crabs, and fish. And this can impact stock size and reproductive capacity because they contribute to total mortality of both target species and non target species. And ultimately, this can negatively affect landings and net revenues. Back in 2015, Division Marine Fisheries initiated a multi-year study on ghost fishing with funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, whereby we abandoned several strings of commercial pot gear on the bottom, and then we had divers go back and visit it every other week for a 2-year period. And basically, what we found is that by and large, the biodegradable panels and lobster traps that are designed to fail after a few months continue to stay intact when they're left on the bottom, because corrosion doesn't occur when they're not exposed to the air and then back to the ocean. And as a result, we found that these traps, even at the conclusion of the 2-year study, were still intact and still killing lobsters, crabs, and fish at a fairly regular rate. Other impacts can cause damages to habitats, including things like eelgrass and corals, when balls of derelict fishing gear kind of surge back and forth with tides and storms, and this can cause damage to those habitats. And then also it's been found that this can generate microplastic debris as it breaks down in the ocean. Another big issue, one that I deal with quite a bit, is entanglement risk to protected species. Buoyed ALDFG can entangle whales and sea turtles, and one of the biggest issues that we're concerned with is that this dilutes the effectiveness of the risk reduction measures the industry undertakes to protect North Atlantic right whales. And so, as you're aware, we have several closures in the lobster fishery designed to protect North Atlantic right whales, will require all gear to be come out of the water, and any buoyed gear that's abandoned or lost can then pose, entanglement risk to those animals. And as a result of this, DMF has to run a costly and labor-intensive retrieval program to make sure that this gear is out of the way from protected species during the closure. Another issue is that derelict fishing gear can cause a navigation hazard and gear conflicts. So buoyed ALDFG poses a navigation hazard to boaters who get ropes caught in their propellers. And then unbuoyed ALDFG causes gear conflict issues with mobile gear fishers who inadvertently tow their nets or dredges through it in the ocean floor. Both of these things can cause a safety risk to the mariner, and both of these things can cause both damage to the vessel and gear in some events. In addition to causing impact to the marine environment, there are also issues related to I'm just going to call it derelict gear because I'm tired of saying that acronym a million times. There are several issues associated with derelict gear when it washes up on shore. And typically what happens is during large storm events, gear that's caught out in the storms kind of gets balled up and then surge and tidal action deposits it's up on coastal areas, on beaches. Um, and this is typically, as I said, occurs after large storm events, especially nor'easters. Um, Most of the gear that is washed up, and this is kind of an important point to this issue, as you can see from these pictures, are severely damaged. I mean, this isn't salvageable fishing gear that's of any value. This is just big. This is largely just marine debris. It's big chunks of traps and balls of rope, um, and this litters coastal beaches and all creates an eyesore issue. And it also creates a real management issue for municipalities and property owners, who have to deal with it. As you can see in the inset picture here, heavy equipment being used to remove a big gear ball off one of our beaches. Um, this also can create a little bit of a safety issue for unknowing beachgoers. A lot of times, fragments of these traps will break off and get buried in the sand, and folks will step on them and injure their feet, and etc. And in general, overall arching issues with derelict fishing gear is disposal and removal are very difficult. Under current mass law, derelict gear, even damaged and non-functional gear, are considered personal property. And so technically, this gear cannot be disposed of without notifying the owners and giving them 60 days to claim it. Um, it's costly and logistically difficult to remove and transport. Large quantities of gear often require use of heavy equipment in large trucks. Um, in many cases, this gear is washing up in remote or other areas that are logistically difficult to access, or on private property where access is an issue. And then, relative to retrieving gear that's lost on the sea floor, it requires the use of special sonar equipment and grappling gear to retrieve it, which is very labor intensive and costly as well. And then finally, when we are trying to manage this gear, we find that most municipal landfills will not accept it, and that in general, the damage to that gear, it's not really salvageable. It's not really worth repurposing. So we're just left with a large amount of basically marine debris that we need to manage, and it causes a lot of logistical issues. So trying to get an overview of the statement of the underlying issue here, problem is that we really understand the issues related to it. There are numerous problems that impacts from derelict fishing gear, and these are pretty well understood. And in general, we have a strong interest in addressing the issue. DMF and the Mass Environmental Police have been working on this for decades. We get interest from municipalities, conservation groups, and commercial fishermen who are interested in cleaning this up. But unfortunately, because of our current state laws, the efficient management of this is not really possible. I'm going to briefly just go over the two general laws in question here that kind of handcuff us relative to dealing with derelict fishing gear. And that the first one is Mass General Law in Chapter 130, Section 31. And basically, what Section 31 does is it basically protects all fishing gear, defined here, that washes up on the shore, beaches, or flats. Basically, that no one can molest, touch, or otherwise do anything with fishing gear that washes up. And then second is Section 32, which essentially lays out the course of action when it does wash up. And so in this section, whether it's on public or private land, the owner of the fishing gear are allowed to up to 30 days to go recover it, and without any liability of trespass. And then in the event that they don't, the property owner essentially has give them 60 days prior to them being able to basically take ownership of that gear. And because of this, we're not able to really allow large scale just beach cleanups or fishing gear cleanups in general without having supervision from Mass Environmental Police. Um, and so, as I mentioned, it can only right now we can only allow this under the authority of supervision of MEP under Chapter 130, Section 9. And essentially, the statutes, these Chapter 31 and Chapter 32, they're antiquated. They were enacted in 1941 when, as I showed you, the fishery was much smaller and the material used to construct gears were biodegradable at this point. So we didn't have the scale of the derelict fishing gear issue back then, and nor could have the legislature at the time envision neither the scale or the fact that advances in materials would make this gear last indefinitely and it become such a problem. The other issues with these statutes is that what we found is that they do not differentiate between intact fishing gear and fishing gear debris, and this is kind of a key distinction in trying to be able to differentiate uh, fishing gear that would likely be still valuable to the owner and worth salvaging versus just debris that is not. And so that's something that we hope to address with this. And also, they do not consider the impacts of ghost fishing and proliferation that we've learned about through research. And certainly at the time, they did not consider the impacts that a buoyed derelict fishing gear would have on protected species. So recommendations from the group was to develop a comprehensive management strategy that balances property rights with the need to efficiently handle and clean up derelict fishing gear. This would primarily require a legislative solution, and so we're recommending that that the legislature consider amending Chapter 130, Section 31, so that it still maintains the property rights for fishing gear, but allows DMF to regulate the handling of derelict fishing gear, or in this case, ALDFG. We're recommending rescinding Chapter 130, Section 32, because we feel that we can handle this via regulation relative to differentiating between gear that's valuable and should be given back to the owner versus gear that can be destroyed or repurposed. And then finally, we noted that there are several areas where we need to refine statutory definitions in Chapter 1. And that's for one to define, make changes to the definition of closed season, make a new definition for open season, and this relates back to the need to manage derelict fishing gear during our trap pot closures to protect North Atlantic right whales. And so we want to have the ability for gear that's left behind in the water during that closure to be able to quickly and effectively remove it and dispose of that gear. And in addition, we also need to adopt new definitions to differentiate between fishing gear and fishing gear debris. And so the proposed modification here, you can see, is that we've kind of eliminated in this the specific language that spells out in the statute fish trap, seine, lobster, crab pot, etc., and replaced that with fishing gear, and then added, notwithstanding the Division of Marine Fisheries, with the approval of the Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission and the Department of Fish and Game, shall promulgate regulations that may authorize or permit the removal of fishing gear from the waters under the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth and the adjacent coastal shoreline. Fishing gear debris collected under the division authority shall not be subjected to General Law Chapter 134. So this gets back to the property ownership laws. And so what we're trying to do here is distinguish fishing gear from fishing gear debris, and essentially then give us the authority to basically dispose of fishing gear debris in this case. I think Dan has his hand raised.
No, Bob, I'm going to wait until you
Okay,
finish.
thanks. Sorry. Yeah, I just saw it pop up. And as I noted, we're recommending to outright rescind Chapter 32, which does away with the need for a property owner to give 60 days notice before they can take ownership of the gear, and an additional 30 days for them to come retrieve it. And then I kind of wanted to get into the definitions a little bit. under Chapter 1. This is what we found where I think the meat of the matter really lies. And so the task force kind of dove in with trying to be fairly surgical in creating a few definitions that allow us to make distinctions that easily separate the difference between intact fishing gear and what we would consider, marine fishing gear debris. So in this case, we'd like to include a definition in Chapter 1 for fishing gear, which would be a trap, net, fish car, or other contrivance that is intact, keyword intact, functions as is intended to take, hold, or capture fish, and is maintained in the water during an open season. And so, again, open season is a new, clear, additional distinction here. The reason for that is for that specific language of open season is that we would like to be able to just remove and get rid of gear that is left open, left in the water during a closed season. And so it would not under this new definition, gear left behind in a closed area would not be considered intact or fishing gear. It would be classified as fishing gear debris. And so along those lines, we would add a definition for fishing gear debris, which would be a trap, net, fish car, or other contrivance that is not intact, does not function as intended to take, hold, or capture fish, or is maintained during a closed season. Additionally, currently the definition for closed season is it simply the time during which fish cannot be lawfully taken. We would like to amend that to closed season, the time during which fish cannot be lawfully taken, or area when and where the use of fishing gear is prohibited. And so this distinction basically, we want to make sure that in cases when there is a closed season, that although we know fish can't be landed, that in this case it's also the gear cannot be left in the ocean. And I think that's just another kind of safeguard relative to not, giving situations whereby we're contributing to the issue, the fishing, derelict fishing gear issue. And then finally, adopting, which is not currently in the chapter, a definition for open season, which is the time during which fish may be lawfully be taken, or the time or area where the use of a particular fishing gear is allowed. So again, making the distinction of that you can both fish, but also you can have gear in the water at that time. Part of this of DMF through these statutory changes would be giving DMF the regulatory authority the authority to regulate derelict fishing gear. And so one of the things that DMF would need to consider, and that this task force spent a lot of time kind of getting into the weeds and discussing, was the need for defining intact commercial fishing gear. Luckily, there's a lot of precedent throughout the country, other states who've kind of tackled this issue and have come up with some definitions. And largely, what we found was that it's often not just one element or one succinct definition that you can give intact fishing gear, but rather it's a number of considerations or a number of conditions that you can dictate. And so what we came up with is for a commercial trap to constitute intact fishing gear, it must have at least 3 of the following elements. And so that is a buoy that is marked as set forth in CMR 4.13, a buoy line that complies with marking and modifications required set forth in CMR 12, current year's trap tag associated with the valid current year's fishing permit set forth in CMR 6, period 31, or finally a trap gear configuration requirements set forth in CMR 6. And CMR 6 basically defines all the required elements of a trap, such as escape vent, functioning ghost panel, trap tags, etc., etc. And so, what this intact definition essentially does is one, it ensures that the owner is identifiable. The traps has all the elements that make it functional, and that the buoy line is identifiable to the fishery. And so these are kind of three primary components that we think are a good distinction to basically separate an intact fishing gear from what we would consider fishing gear debris. Other things that DMF will need to consider in the regulatory framework would be the need to kind of give clear guidance on how the public may interact with intact fishing gear and also fishing gear debris. And this includes defining who may handle the gear, when the gear may be handled, what collection methods would be allowable, from where the gear may be removed, whether permitting and reporting is required, and what post removal options exist. And within this, we expect there to be a kind of four primary circumstances where the public or state agencies would interact with ALDFG, and that would be during a shore cleanup, directed at sea gear removal. So programs like the Center for Coastal Studies have done, where they received a grant to use sonar and then tow grapples to retrieve derelict fishing gear on the bottom. Incidental recovery, and so this would be a good example of this, and this for any of the folks in the commission who are experienced mobile gear fishing, they can relate to this. Is it's very common over the course of running an otter trawl or a scalp dredge, whatever, to run into lost fishing gear, derelict fishing gear on the bottom. And right now, again, because of these current state statutes, that gear has to basically just be thrown back over because they're not allowed to possess it. And so one of the things that we hope to regulate is the allowance for when a mobile gear fisher runs into said gear, instead of just tossing it back over, that they're able to bring it back into port and dispose of it properly. And then finally, just enforcement actions. And this is already, we don't need any new framework for this. This is already, we have the authority, or Mass Environmental Police have the authority, and we already have ongoing gear retrieval work going on, but this is one of the other circumstances. And then closing out here, the benefits to having DMF regulate ALDFG is that what we've learned is that the challenges related to ALDFG, they're not static, and they evolve over time. And so unanticipated things like changes in how gear configuration, gear construction, seasons, fisheries, they change. And as a result, there's a need to kind of change the strategy to manage the issue. DMF has the ability to respond to these changes through its regulatory process, typically within 6 months, which makes us fairly adept and nimble in trying to meet on upcoming challenges. And then finally, it's also important here that our regulatory approach benefits from being fine-tuned for the Marine Fisheries Commission in this case, and where we have that extra oversight and that experience of commercial fishers here who can help us respond. And then also finally, that these regulations are subject to review and approval by both the commissioner and the governor. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Hey, Bob, if I could just weigh in, I just want to make a couple of comments before you take the questions. So the commission can see here how well refined these proposals are, and it really reflects the great input we got from not only the participants like the Center for Coastal Studies, but also law enforcement and of course legal counsel. We had you mentioned Tori LeBate from the Department of Fish and Game, but she also had the assistance of her the lead counsel, Jennifer Sula, and I think the Executive Office Environmental Affairs attorneys got involved as well. So this is really well baked. I also want to mention this is from 25 years of experience that we've dealt with grabbing gear and being really challenged with what do we do with it. So from the early years of the right whale conservation regulations that we enacted back in the 90s, we've created a marking scheme that was specific to gear that was going to be left during the winter. It was a special marking scheme just below the buoy that would distinguish between abandoned gear and active gear. And then we even banned single traps during the winter, so that we could again identify the lost gear from the active gear, and also try to discourage the recreational gear from being left out there. But for 25 years, we've really challenged. We've been so challenged with, all right, now that we've grabbed the gear, now how do we dispose of it? And if someone's lost a single trap, they just don't come get it. You know what I mean? Even though we'd have a gear storage and we put the stuff aside. And more recently, we've seized more and more gear because of the increasing threat, but also because now we have large scale closures. And so I can't thank you, Bob, you and the team enough for all the work you've done on this.